After World War II finished, things got hard for a lot of German women. What they told us was that they were going to do many different tests on you in order to keep you from having children. As the Red Army took over Berlin in 1945, they assaulted and murdered thousands of them, as we look at what Soviet forces did to German women after the war. On the run in a destroyed city after the fall. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the Nazi regime stopped. This was the end of World War II in Europe. Just as the Allies got close, the city saw its last fierce battle. Its people were left to figure out how to live in the rubble, which was an unknown and tough task. Berlin was destroyed by the war, and the city's infrastructure, business, and social fabric were all torn apart. There were shortages and a strong sense of hopelessness. Berlin was a mess when the war was over. Basic services were almost completely broken down, and buildings and streets were both full of broken pieces. The city that was once thriving and famous for its historical importance and beautiful building was now linked to destruction. People from all walks of life died, and a lot of property was damaged in the last battle for Berlin. A huge number of bombs had been dropped on the city. Food, water, and medical supplies were in short supply, which made things very hard for the people who were still alive. The infrastructure of the city was badly damaged, and the public transportation systems were a mess, making it hard to get supplies. Many people had to leave their homes because they were destroyed, and others had to find temporary protection in public buildings, the rubble of other homes, or even buildings that had been bombed. People in Berlin were worried about not having enough food after the war. For a long time, the city's supply line relied on rural areas a lot. But the conflict destroyed both farming and transportation systems. People were so hungry that the black market did very well. Because food amounts were so low, people often bartered to get things they needed in exchange for valuables like clothes, jewelry, and other goods. In a world where famine was a real possibility, community strength was very important for life. When things went wrong, friends came together to help each other by sharing food and other things they had. So, charities and soup kitchens sprung up to help the poor, and volunteers worked hard to solve the problem, bringing people back together and giving them a sense of humanity in the middle of the chaos. After the war, it was also hard to get medical care. Hospitals that were damaged made things even worse for the healthcare system, which already had to deal with a lot of war deaths and health problems caused by bad housing. People who got sick were often left to their own devices because there weren't enough doctors, nurses, and other medical staff to go around. Berliners began to think about how to rebuild their lives in the city, even though they had to deal with a lot of problems because they were living under the rubble. As soon as the Allies saw how bad things were, they started relief operations to help those who needed it. With the help of international organizations and the start of food aid programs, a time of slow recovery began. There was also a big change in the political mood. By the summer of 1945 in Berlin, the Allies were split into 4 groups: the American, the British, the French, and the Soviet. Because of this split, people came up with different ideas about how to lead and repair. Some areas used harsh punishments and strict rules, especially in the areas that used to be ruled by the Soviet Union. Other areas focused on fixing infrastructure and bringing back public services. Berlin was split into East and West because of this policy split. The fate of these 2 halves would decide the city's future for decades. The war also took a toll on people's minds long after it was over. After losing so much and being violently attacked, many people found it hard to move on with their lives. Accounts of people who didn't give up showed how strong and determined people can be when things get hard. Artists, writers, and filmmakers recorded the truth of life after World War II and made a body of work that showed the hopes and struggles of a city rebuilding itself. It was hard to heal and change after the city was destroyed. Getting by was just the first step. Over the next few years, Berlin would be greatly affected by changes in state policy and the political atmosphere caused by the Cold War. West Berlin was one of many towns in Europe that did better financially after the Marshall Plan helped to rebuild Western Europe. The money from the plan led to new ideas, better facilities, and more economic growth all around. In the years after World War II, Berlin's artists, musicians, and intellectuals tried to rethink who they were. This led to changes in the city's culture scene. As the war wounds in the city began to heal, it became a center for new ideas and groups. Berlin's ability to recover and rebuild after the war became a sign of the human spirit's ability to start over and come up with new ideas. When Berlin was destroyed and people had to fight to stay alive in the rubble, it was a moving example of how the human spirit can overcome impossible odds. Cry of Fear, the horrible fate of German women. In 1945, the Nazi regime fell, and millions of Germans, mostly women, entered a very scary time. Following the conclusion of the war, a landscape marked by destruction, chaos, and pain appeared. During this time, many sad stories about German women came to light. These women went through a lot of hard things, like being raped, being forced to move, and social unrest. When Nazi Germany was defeated, the country was in shambles. Cities that had been bombed and damaged had their structures fall apart, and basic services were cut off. Things were already not going well before the Allied control zones split Germany in half, making two separate regions with very different policies. During times of widespread social unrest, there was a rise in crime and violence, especially crimes against women. Instead of bringing freedom, the end of the war made many German women suffer in new ways. Since the fight had mostly hurt men, many were left vulnerable and without help. A lot of people felt anxious and unstable during the social unrest that followed the fall of the government. The high rate of sexual abuse was one of the scariest things about life in Germany after the war for many women. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France had become the four occupied powers, and their troops were being very cruel to German women. More than 100,000 women may have been raped or sexually assaulted during this time. As the Soviet Red Army moved into Eastern Germany, they were known for sexually assaulting many women. About 100,000 to 200,000 women were raped just in Berlin. Many women were mentally and physically hurt by these events, and they also made it more common for people to keep quiet about sexual abuse. Sadly, social views that blame the victim only made the pain of these crimes worse when they were kept quiet. A lot of women had to deal with the effects of these kinds of assaults, like their shame and being left out of social groups because of it. No one gave it a second thought. They just accepted that abuse against women was common. German women also had to deal with being forced to move and having their finances suffer. A lot of people had to leave their homes because of the war, on top of all the horrible things that happened to them. This number included both Germans and people from areas that were once controlled who were running away into the unknown, often without any way to get help. Many German women had to leave their homes. A lot of women had their husbands or fathers killed in war, leaving them to take care of their kids and themselves, while they fought for things like food, shelter, and safety. Many women ended up being the main breadwinners in their broken homes because they took on hard jobs in farms, factories, or as housekeepers. Gender roles changed during and after the war, which made it harder to understand what it means to be feminine and do housework. Some women's jobs gave them chances to become more independent, but for most, just getting by was enough to make things worse. The goal of the Allied Occupation Authority was to fix up Germany's social and economic systems. However, they ran into a lot of problems and opposition as they tried to get things back to normal. Women often had to deal with more of the economic problems, like being exploited. Because of the bad conditions, many people had to make hard choices, like entering into casual relationships just to make ends meet. The war and its fallout had a huge effect on the mental health of German women. Many of them felt a wide range of emotions, from anger and grief to deep sadness and hopelessness. Many people had mental health problems because of the traumas of war, which were made worse by personal losses and social unrest. Society put a lot of value on getting better after the war, but it didn't always see how common mental health problems like sadness, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder were. It was also usual for people to hide their emotions because they thought it was best for their families and communities if they seemed strong and normal. Many women suffered longer because they thought they had to hide their pain in order to stay alive. Again and again, there was quiet. Especially for German women, cultural norms at the time often forced women to put the needs of their families and communities ahead of their own mental and emotional health. The years right after World War II were terrible for a lot of women. They had to deal with a harsh reality that included sexual assault, being forced to move, the fall of the economy, and mental trauma. In this setting, the story of the German women shows universal themes like sticking with something even when things get hard and the strength of the human spirit to handle great suffering. Tragedy of war, harrowing accounts of Red Army victims. When World War II finished, a lot of people felt relieved and free, especially in places where cruel governments had been in power. But a darker story came out, especially for people who were hurt by the Red Army's words and actions. Millions of people faced new forms of violence and oppression in the years after the war, as the battlefields were cleared and Europe's borders were redrawn. These included huge retaliation, displacement, and social unrest. When World War II was over, the Red Army was a strong force because it helped bring down Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union wanted to gain more power in Eastern Europe after the war, which changed the way things looked there. People who lived in areas that had been ruled by Nazi forces were deeply and permanently affected by what the Red Army did during and after the war. This expansion often came at a terrible cost. Reports of widespread violence against citizens hurt the Red Army's image as a group of heroes after the war was over. As the troops moved deeper into Germany and Eastern Europe, they killed anyone they thought was working with the enemy or against them. Millions of people were scared while their forces raped, killed, and stole from cities like Berlin. During the Red Army's occupation, there was a lot of sexual abuse against women, which was a scary fact. There is a story that hundreds of thousands or even millions of women in Eastern Europe were sexually assaulted by Soviet troops. After the city was taken over, between 100,000 and 200,000 women were raped in Berlin. Soldiers were free to move into villages in the countryside and cause chaos. They hurt communities just as much as they hurt cities. Many people thought that these crimes weren't as important as the fight against fascism. So people who lived through them were often shamed and kept quiet. Because of this, the pain these women went through had a huge effect on both them and their families. Because survivors were having a hard time getting support and validation from society, they started to keep the sexual attacks secret. Millions of people were taken away from their homes against their will in the last few months of World War II. Most of them were in Eastern Europe. Germans, Poles, and other ethnic groups were forced to leave their homes while the lines between countries were changed. During these deportation drives, which are often called the expulsion of Germans, violence and cruelty were widespread. Germans who lived in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were robbed, killed, and hurt by both the locals and the Soviet force that was there to control the countries. The Red Army set up forced labor camps to arrest people they thought were working with the enemy or a threat to the new socialist order. This directly led to these people having to move. It was very hard for many of the prisoners to get food and medical care. There were too many people in the barracks, so some say that disease spread fast. This made a bad situation even worse. Many people who lived through these prison camps remembered how cruel the guards were and how constant the fear of retaliation was. The horrible things the Red Army did to many people had long-lasting effects on their mental health. People who had been sexually abused or forced to move often felt shame, blame, and trauma that wouldn't go away, even after the crisis was over, because they were stigmatized or tried to hide their experiences. A lot of people had trouble getting back into their neighborhoods. They felt even more alone and lost because they didn't have any social networks to lean on and didn't talk about their pain. Generations after the people who were killed by the Red Army felt the effects of their trauma, hiding their pain and shame. People often told each other whispered stories about these scary events decades after they happened. The groups that were affected by this trauma were still feeling the effects of it. The memories, family structures, and connections of the group were tragic and complicated. The stories that Red Army victims told after the war are very different from how most people thought about freedom after the Soviet victory. As troops moved across Europe, it was normal for people to be sexually assaulted, severely repressed, or sent into exile against their will. These efforts had long-lasting effects that showed how complicated war and freedom can be, as well as how important it is to recognize the pain citizens felt during and after the war. Rescue or more suffering, German women in the hands of Western allies. The end of World War II and the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945 made a big difference in world politics and set up a new order in Europe. The Allies came into Germany to find a country in ashes, and millions of people, mostly women, who had been through a terrible war and were in a lot of pain. German women's experiences during the war were difficult and often contradictory, because the Western Allies were both a relief from Nazi oppression and a cause of more suffering. When the war was over, Germany was a mess because so many people had died, there was social unrest, and towns were destroyed. As a result of so many men being killed or going missing, women were in especially dangerous situations. Women stepped up to be the main providers of food and care for their children. They had to deal with scarcity, trauma, and the chance of starting over from the wreckage of war. In many ways, the arrival of Allied troops from the West marked the end of the Nazi dictatorship's totalitarianism and persecution. Some people saw the Allied soldiers as liberators, but there were also tyrannical undertones to this freedom, and the complicated web of relationships between the two would finally show the harsh and gentle policies that shaped the post-war period. During the years after the war, the Western Allies sometimes tried to help and protect certain German women. The policies of the Allied governments were mainly aimed at helping the civilian population. For example, they provided food and housing, provided humanitarian aid, and set up centers for people who had to leave their homes. Some of the women who got help from organizations like the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration had lost their husbands or been hurt mentally because of the war. The Western Allies tried to settle Germany down and make it safe after the war. During the occupation, women in this setting were told to report any abuse or mistreatment they saw. This helped build a support system that kept them safe and gave them help. In the same time period, healthcare and educational facilities started to be rebuilt. There were also efforts to bring back social services to help women fit back into society. On the other hand, the presence of the Western Allies caused a lot of terrible suffering for many German women. Reports say that the occupying troops sexually abused women, just like the Red Army did. Tens of thousands of German women were sexually assaulted while the country was under occupation. Along with hurting people physically, this violence had terrible mental and emotional effects. A lot of people went through mental pain, like shame, loneliness, and being looked down upon by others. A lot of violence happened around people who had been sexually abused because cultural beliefs didn't always push people to talk about these things. In addition to dealing with the physical and mental effects of the stress, victims often had to deal with criticism from other people. Also, women felt betrayed and unhappy when they lost help in their first few months of work. Even though there were humanitarian efforts, many women were having more money problems, losing their homes, and still feeling the effects of stress. While women were still dealing with the effects of the war, the Allies were putting in place new rules and setting up the government for after the war. In the years after World War II, when German women were trying to figure out who they were, the idea of gender changed in a big way. Because of how the war changed gender roles, many women began to question what people thought about them. There were more people who went against the norm and got jobs because they had to support their families. Slowly but surely, the roles of men and women changed, with women slowly taking on duties that were usually done by men. At the same time, some women began to fight back against the unfair treatment they had been given. As new grassroots groups sprung up, they gave women a way to speak out against violence, social unfairness, and being forced to move. In a society that was in chaos, these groups stood out as parts of a bigger fight for freedom and respect. In the stories of German women kept by Western allies after World War II, there were stories of being saved, stories of being miserable, and stories of sticking it out. When the Allies came, women felt safer than they really were, but they also made it easier for new kinds of abuse and exploitation to happen. In the fight to stay alive after the war, issues of justice, social norms, and identity all got mixed up. It makes me sad to see how the Allies and Russians treated German women, even though the Nazis were terrible. They were just as bad as the Nazis in the end. We hope you liked this video. Watch another video here.